조심해!
Greetings and salutations, honored legionaries. So I am here with Sergeant Barnes on an advisory mission to the, let's say, the state of Myanmar. And we're just advising General Lang, great man, very prestigious man, very upworthy man. I like this guy very much. Just giving you a background here, the Burmese conflict had to do with a very interesting scenario where the United States liberals were trying to subvert the Myanmar government and, in effect, using Dominion voter ballots, very interesting that we had the same issue here, was accused of running an unfree and unfair election, which the CIA allegedly had fixed in favor of their puppet, and the general in charge said, "No, we're sovereign. We won't allow foreign governments to dictate our every move, our internal, let's say, political premises here." And so he decided to invalidate the elections, to restabilize the republic, the state of Myanmar. And unfortunately, a lot of liberals have some problems with that. But the State Administrative Council, called the SAC, has the problem well in hand, although he may need some advice. And so here am I with Sergeant Barnes reminiscing about history, talking about how it is that certain political conflicts arise, and how is it that we can ensure the integrity of our polities, of our city-state, right? I guess I'm referencing the Greek concept of the city-state, but really, in my mind, every time I think of the American Republic, I think of it as a city, that gleaming city on the hill, for which we'll fight and suffer and win for, right? Champion for, right? But ultimately, we have to come to understand that every gleaming city, unfortunately, is a cesspit. And it's funny that Cato was derided by Cicero for acting as if and legislating as if, because he was the center of Rome and the Roman Republic, the late Roman Republic, as if, it was Plato's Republic, as opposed to the, in the words of Cicero, the whorehouse of Romulus, excuse me. And so what he means by that is, of course, we have an ideal far ahead of ourselves, above ourselves, that we strive to fight and maintain and establish and champion. However, the converse is the ugly truth. And the ugly truth is that there are enemies within, enemies without, who pursue the objectives, their personal objectives, underhandedly, and are always the sworn enemy of patriots everywhere. And this is no less true in Myanmar than anywhere else. But the interesting thing about Myanmar is that General Lang took the initiative. He was a leader, a champion of his people, a patriot, and stepped in instead of sitting idly by while his country was subverted and, in effect, turned into a puppet of the United States, which you have to absolutely have some respect for. He believes in himself, and he fights for it, and he put his life on the line. I mean, he could have easily been one of these DOD generals who want a pension and a safe spot, but instead he ran the gauntlet of international embargoes and international challenges and insisted that Myanmar is free. Now, this is not a new, let's say, scenario. This is not a new fork in the road decision game that exists. I hate saying decision game because it insinuates that it's trivial or frivolous. No, these are matters of life and death, of honor and dishonor. And ultimately, the roots, especially in European history, but elsewhere, the roots of fighting for what's right, for your country, for patriotism, for the concept of honor and duty and so on, is a long one. And unfortunately for those in the Western canon, especially in the liberal West today, much of history is retconned, okay? Much of history, regardless of the era, is not simply written by the victor. This is incorrect. It's actually written by those who scribble. And usually the scribblers are those who were incapable of acting in the world, effusing themselves. And this is no less true back then as it is now. So take, for instance, the reason why there isn't what is derided as right-wing. I hate this term, but the reason why is because everyone of that proclivity is a high achiever. They're the ones that are actively in the business field or engineering or the military, productive members of society, and ultimately don't have time. They don't have the time to reflect and to write, and only in old age. And unfortunately, old age brings, let's say, a weakness of will if one is not on guard against it, right? This is not a fate, but a choice, or rather an unwitting seduction of old age. Do not seduce yourself to the apathy and weakness of old age. You can always be young, because youth is a matter of fire within. It's the fire within, and if you constantly cultivate it with the warrior ethos, you can be a young man well into your 90s. And there are many. For instance, there's a story of a great museum keeper who fought off ISIS in Palmyra to, in effect, defend the artifacts of the Palmyrian and Roman and Greek empire that ISIS wanted to completely deface and destroy as part of its iconoclastic ideology. And he died fighting for what's right. That is a young man. That is beautiful. That is kalos kagathos. And so it doesn't matter how old you are, it's just a matter of choice. But for those who are not cognizant, it can creep up on you, right? But regardless, returning to the idea of historiography, the idea is this, is that ultimately the scribblers win. And so even, for instance, in the Roman era, the scribblers, specifically Suetonius and a number of other senatorial aristocratic men who were systematically shut out and who were republicans as opposed to Caesarians, would deride, basically smear everyone. And the only people that, or only emperors that is, and politicians that they would write in a positive light, or portray them in a positive light, were the ones who, of course, catered to their biases, right? To the republic. But remember, we are Caesarians here. We're imperialists. We love the legion. And you have to remember that these guys didn't. They wanted their own personal power. They wanted their oligarchy back. And so a lot of what Suetonius would write was basically nasty, disgusting, what amounts to internet forum posts about histories of emperors. And this is why you really should take a lot of these ancient sources with a heavy grain of salt. Maybe even a packful, because ultimately they hated them for so much, and for those emperors who were especially, let's say, checking of the selfishness and self-serving nature of the oligarchy, they were especially vindictive and nasty against. And so I really take it, like for instance Nero, I really don't think any of the stories about him were true, but the allegations of incest and the absurdities of prostituting oneself and playing the harp while Rome burned and all of these absurdities. And of course, this is not to say that every emperor is perfect or there's no opposite to this, but you can tell that this is a lie. And this was a common Roman smear of their political opponents. Oh, you're this or that and whatever, and it brings defamation to a person's name, libel. And there's a reason why emperors would find out these secret histories written by these senators and usually extirpate them or burn them and so on. It's because they're filled with lies and petty prejudices that these quote-unquote noble men let poison and well up in their hearts. But the truth is no less so than those of ancient Greece. So, for instance, what we call a tyrant today, the term tyrannos, only meant in a sense, a Caesar figure, or rather, an individual who came to power through extra constitutional means. And this is not to say that this is like a negative thing. An emergency of the state usually calls for it. Julius Caesar, the man who coined the term Caesarian, was one such man who was responding to the depravity and the, let's say, the lack of leadership, the old optimates and senatorial classes were prosecuting and running the republic. They were effectively running it into the ground and dividing and destroying Rome from within for their own personal gain. Cato included, by the way. And you have to remember, like, an elite or an aristocracy of a nation must earn it constantly, every day. And when the aristocracy becomes too rapacious, as they were, and too self-serving and too operative on the basis of personal gain and at the loss of the Roman polity, the people themselves, the soldiery, the merchants, the peasants, and obviously the slaves as well. Well, what happens is you are invalid. You need to be, let's say, swept away. And this is what Caesar brought to Rome as a republic and turned into empire, because he adjusted and addressed this core issue of balancing the interests of the elite, which rightfully deserve the greater share because they're the leaders, they're the ones who are capable, they're the leaders. There's nothing wrong with that. What is wrong is when they were doing that at the cost, not the benefit of the people. And so ultimately, the Caesarian figure, the emperor figure, the strongman autocrat figure, is in effect balancing the interests of all elements of society into a harmonious whole, a synthesis. And this is no less true than in ancient Greece, where a number of different what is called tyrannies arose in the the city-state era of the Hellenic world, and most importantly in the Aeolian era or segment of Greece. And remember, the Greeks are divided into a number of different ethnes, and so there's the Dorians, the Aeolians, the Ephesians, and so on, Ephrygians, if I'm correct. And ultimately, they all kind of operate for their own self-interest, or rather, within this greater Hellenic world, they're part of the same thing. However, tyrannies arose because the same dynamic that played out in Rome with Caesar played out all across the Hellenic world, where cities that were run by oligarchies, right, rich men, usually merchant men, even if they were constitutionally legitimized, so let's say even if it were the case that they were the holders of power legitimately by the laws on the book, they had lost the mandate of the people and were operating and ruling to the adverse well-being of the city-state as a whole, including the small people, the small folk, but everyone, not simply the people that were existing at the time, but for posterity as well. Because remember, a true leader, a true statesman, a true prince always rules with the concept that he rules, he labors for a tree whose shade he will never enjoy. That is the ultimate ethic and litmus of the test. And they failed it spectacularly. And so there were a number of what is called tyrannies that arose. Namely, the most famous of them was the tyranny of Pisistratus. Pisistratus was the Athenian tyrant, who was actually, very interestingly enough, the one who seeded the philosophical, cultural revolution of the Hellenic world. Because prior to him, there was, of course, culture and science and philosophy and sophistry and so on in the positive sense. However, there was no unity, there was no patron, there was no organized sense of this kind of greater cultural work, and it certainly wasn't conscious. And for the first time, Pisistratus was the one who aggregated all these things together, secured to him in his court all the best philosophers and artists and designers and architects and intellectuals of every kind and artists of every kind and place to his court to beautify Athens, to make it beautiful, to bring itself up from the meanness of its origins to a worldwide empire, of Athens, especially a cultural hegemony, the Athens that we know of today. Remember, people always like to say that the cultural impetus for development in Athens came because of democracy. That is a falsehood. In fact, it was because of the tyrant figure, that was able to concentrate not simply the fiscal means and the power means, like the political means, but also in his person a unified sense of style. I know this sounds kind of frivolous, but it's important that you understand style and taste, a unity of taste and style, homogeneity, uniformity of taste and style, is actually the core element of what is tasteful and good. And just to illustrate my point here, I think it's important because it gives you context, and though it is not the main element of this discussion, it's absolutely requisite. So bear with me here, Legionnaires. I'm going to read from Werner Jaeger's Paideia, The Ideals of Greek Culture. And this is the chapter regarding the cultural policy of the tyrants, so to speak. And again, tyrants in a positive, not a negative sense. Tyrants simply meaning rule of one. I'm reading now. Let us turn back to consider Athens and the rich cities of the Isthmus as they were in the middle of the 6th century, when the time was ripe for the appearance of tyranny in Greece proper. Athens represented the last stage of the movement towards tyranny. Solon had long prophesied its coming. In the poems of his old age, he spoke of it as imminent, and finally he lived to see it become a fact. Although sprung from the Athenian nobility, he had broken away from the traditions of his caste. His poems had prefigured his laws and delineated, and his life had embodied a new ideal of human character, an ideal whose attainment was independent of the privileges of birth and property. Yet when he demanded justice for the oppressed workers of Attica, he never envisaged anything like the democracy which later claimed him as its founder. He merely wished the old aristocratic state to justify itself morally and economically, and at first he had no thought of its impending downfall. But the nobles had learned nothing from history, and they learned nothing from Solon. After he retired from office, party strife broke out again with renewed fury. We know nothing of the history of the succeeding decades, but Aristotle saw from the Archon lists that the government of Athens must have been seriously disturbed over several occasions. In some years there was, indeed, no Archon at all, and one Archon attempted to hold his office for 2 years. There were 3 factions, headed by the most powerful families: the nobles of the coast, the nobles of the interior, and the nobles of the Diacria, the poor highlands of Attica. All 3 parties courted the support of the people, for the people was now becoming an important factor in politics, although it was not an organized party with a leader to voice its deep discontent. By skillful tactics, Pisistratus, the leader of the Diacrian nobles, maneuvered his rivals into a disadvantageous position, although some, such as the Alcmenids, were far richer and far more powerful than he. He secured the support of the people, made concessions to their demands. After several vain attempts to seize power, alternating with periods of exile, he succeeded at last in establishing himself, with the help of a bodyguard, which was not armed with spears like soldiers, but with clubs. The power thus founded, he strengthened throughout his long reign so firmly that after his death his sons inherited it without disturbance. Okay, so we've established the purpose and the, let's say, mechanism by which this dynamic happens, right? Just like Rome, same thing happened. I continue to read now. Tyranny is of the utmost importance, both as a historical phenomenon and as a motivating force behind the far-reaching cultural revolution which begins in the 6th century with the fall of the aristocracy and the political rise of the bourgeoisie. And bourgeoisie defined not in Marxian terms, but the, let's say, the small merchant people, let's say middle classes, right? It's not simply upper middle class, but lower middle class as well. So basically people that owned their own home, they may have owned a slave, let's say. They had means, but not great means. They were roughly private citizens, okay? So I continue to read now. As a typical example, we shall examine the Athenian tyranny in some detail, since we know more about it than any other. But we must first review the previous development of tyranny in other Greek states. In most of the cities where it existed, we know more than the name and a few remarkable actions of the tyrant. How the tyranny arose and what brought it into being, we seldom know. And still more rarely do we know the real personality of the tyrant and the character of his rule. But the surprising unanimity with which all the Greek states turned to this kind of government in and after the 7th century indicates that the causes for its appearance were the same everywhere. In the 6th century, where we have more facts to guide us, we can see that the rise of tyranny was the part of the great social and economic changes which are known to us chiefly from the work of Solon and Theognis. The land-owning nobility, which had until then held supreme power in every state, found its position terribly shaken by the spread of money as a means of exchange to replace the old system of barter and kind. Clinging to outworn economic techniques, they were largely pushed into the background by the possessors of the new wealth gained by trade and industry, and their own ranks were split by the differences which arose when some of the old houses turned to trade also and acquired new wealth. There were many noble families which became impoverished, as Theognis shows, and would no longer maintain their social position. Others, like the Achaemenids in Attica, accumulated such wealth that their power became intolerable to their fellow nobles, and they themselves could not resist the temptation to bid for political power. By severe legislation which virtually made bankrupt peasants and tenant farmers into serfs of the landowner, the agricultural workers were driven to the thoughts of revolution, and discontented noblemen could easily seize power by putting themselves at the head of the unorganized masses. The nouveaux riches who joined the side of the landowning nobility were not welcomed. The nobleman has never been sympathetic to the millionaire merchant, and even the access of strength which they brought was doubtful gain. For joined by the rich, the nobles moved further than ever away from the landless and moneyless masses, and now the situation had narrowed to the simple conflict of rich against poor. Revolution was much nearer. The rise of tyranny was aided by the fact that, without a leader, the commons could not shake off the coercion of the aristocracy. Although they had done so, they were usually content to accept the domination of their leader, now the tyrant. After centuries of obedience to their masters, they could not yet conceive of the ideal of a free people ruling itself. They were even less capable of attaining such an ideal than in the era of the great demagogues. In fact, they could never have attained it even in a later age without the demagogues, and Aristotle was right to base his history of the Athenian democracy in the constitution of the Athenians upon the succession of these its leaders. Tyranny seems to have appeared at the same time in Greece proper as the cities of Ionia and the islands, where we should expect a higher stage of intellectual and political development to have produced it earlier. About the year 600, Miletus, Ephesus, Lesbos, and Samos were all ruled by famous tyrants, who, as a rule, maintained close relations with their fellow tyrants in mainland Greece. Although, or even because, the tyrants had reached power purely through internal revolution, they were associated with one another by bonds of international solidarity, frequently strengthened by dynastic marriages. In fact, they anticipated the democratic and oligarchic party solidarity which was so widespread in the 5th century, and thus, oddly enough, they created the first far-seeing foreign policy for their respective states, and even carried it into action by founding colonies. All such foundations were bound to their metropolis by much closer ties than those acknowledged by earlier colonies. Thus, Sigamum was simply an Athenian fort on the Hellespont. Periander made similar fortress outposts for Corinth in Potidaea, which he founded, and Corcyra, which he had to conquer. In Greece proper, Corinth and Sicyon were the first cities to develop tyranny, and they were followed by Megara and Athens. The Athenian tyranny of Pisistratus was established with the help of the despot Naxos, and he in turn was supported by Pisistratus. In Euboea, too, tyranny appeared very early, but in Sicily, where it was to reach its highest development, it came late. And by the way, this is where we're going, but I'll read again. The only important Sicilian tyrant of the 6th century was Phalaris of Acragas, the founder of his city's prosperity. In Greece, much as we may admire Pisistratus, the greatest of the tyrants was undoubtedly Periander of Corinth, one of the 7 wise men of Hellas. After the fall of the aristocratic government of the Bacchanads, his father had founded a dynasty which retained its power for several generations but reached its zenith under Periander. Pisistratus' part in history was to prepare for the future greatness of Athens, but Periander raised Corinth to a height from which she declined after his death and which he never reached again. Elsewhere in Greece, aristocratic rule continued. As always, it was based on the possession of large estates, and only here and there on great wealth too. A tyranny never lasted longer than 2 or 3 generations. It was usually overthrown by aristocracy after it learned its lesson and became the certain of its policy. But the aristocracy seldom held to power it had recaptured, and usually, as in Athens, had to surrender to the common people. As Polybius explains in his theory of the succession of types of government, the fall of a tyranny was chiefly caused by the inability of the tyrant's sons or grandsons, less brilliant than himself, to maintain the power which they had inherited, or by the despotic misuse of power which they had received from the people. Tyranny became the boogie of fallen aristocrats, and they bequeathed their terror of it to the democracies. But the hatred of tyranny was only a one-sided expression of the fighting spirit in politics. As Burckhardt neatly says, in every Greek there was a hidden tyrant. To be a tyrant was such an obvious and generally accepted form of happiness that Archelaus could describe the contented carpenter no better than by saying that he did not covet a tyranny. The Greeks always felt that the rule of one supremely able man was, in Aristotle's words, according to nature, and they tended to acquiesce in it when it appeared. The earlier tyrannies, were something halfway between the patriarchal kingships of primitive Greece and the rule of the demagogues in the later democracies. Maintaining the external forms of aristocratic government, the despot endeavored to unite all authority in his own person and in those of his adherents. He was supported by a small but effective body of troops. If a state does not produce a legal and efficient form of government for itself, backed by the will of all or most of its citizens, it can be ruled only by an armed minority. But the tyrant's armed force was always visible, and its unpopularity did not diminish with the passing of time. The tyrant was therefore compelled to counterbalance by carefully maintaining the external forms of election to official posts, by systematically cultivating public loyalty to his person, and by pursuing an economic policy which would satisfy the majority of his subjects. Pisistratus sometimes appeared in court when he was involved in a lawsuit in order to demonstrate that the rule of law and order was unshaken. This made a great impression on the public. Every tyrant kept down the old aristocratic families with a strong hand and banished noblemen who might become dangerous rivals, or gave them honorable duties to perform in another part of Greece. Thus Pisistratus supported Miltiades in his important campaign to conquer and colonize the Carnaces, and no tyrant allowed the citizen body to flock to the cities where it might form an organized power to endanger his rule. Both economic and political motives induced Pisistratus to favor the country people of Attica, who loved him dearly in return. Many years later, his tyranny was called the reign of Kronos, the Golden Age, and many sympathetic anecdotes were told of his personal visits to the country and his conversations with the simple peasants, whose hearts he won by a combination of pleasant manners and low taxes. His tactics were a blend of political shrewdness and sound agrarian instinct. He even took the trouble to spare the peasants the journey into town to attend court, for he himself made regular trips around Attica to hold the assizes. And those are taxes, by the way. Going back. Unfortunately, we cannot give such a detailed description of any other tyrant's internal policy, and even this account of Pisistratus we owe to Aristotle, who built it up from the Attic Chronicles. It is impossible to overlook the strong economic element in his work. Compared with it, his political actions were only a stopgap in solutions. The really attractive thing about tyranny, especially that of Pisistratus, was its success. But that success can only be attributed to the supreme personal rule of one man, genuinely gifted and entirely devoted to the service of his people. So, Caesar, right? Interesting. We may well doubt whether all tyrants were as gifted or as devoted, but we must judge the regime only by its best representatives. On the standard of success, it was a period of rapid and valuable progress. Pause here. This is a very important litmus, right? Many of people's critiques is straw manning, which is the opposite. We take the worst examples, or even exaggerate the worst examples of, let's say, in this case, a political form of government, but in general, the worst examples of whatever it may be, some abstract concept played out in reality, and we couch our argument in that. However, it's not as persuasive for those of you gentlemen and legionaries leaders who are trying to be persuasive. You must take whatever the person who is arguing you against you at his best and overcome him by ultimately addressing the question and the abstract question within from the best angle and the most positive light. So, for instance, if we want to critique or, let's say, discredit communism, you cannot take it from the most negative emanations of it, right? So Pol Pot. And even though I'm very much guilty of this, we have to always critique it from the most successful examples of this. So, for instance, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, and one could argue even the Soviet Union. Either way, going back now. On the spiritual side, the rule of the 6th century tyrant may be compared with that of his political opponents, the great lawgivers and Asamitai. There were temporary dictators appointed by many cities and given extraordinary powers in order to introduce permanent changes into the constitution or to restore it after disturbance. So the dictatorship office that we know of in Rome in the archetype of Cincinnatus. They influenced the general standard of cultural principally by creating, through their legislation, an ideal which allowed and even enjoined political activity on the part of the citizens, while the tyrant repressed all individual initiative and himself promoted every action undertaken by the state. Although, then, the tyrant did not educate the citizens towards universal political arete, he became their model in another sense. Without the responsibility which attached to their position, he was the prototype of the statesman of later centuries, so the statesman of the demagogues, as alluded to by Le Bon and his book, The Cultural Mind, or The Social Mind. I'm reading back now. He was the first to show that a nation could be governed on a far-sighted plan involving long-term calculations of means and ends. That is, he was the first to engage in real politics. In political life, and by the way, pause, listen to that. Long-term thoughts, long-term governance being the litmus of what a politician should be. Isn't it telling that our politicians in the United States are so lacking because they only think in election cycles? They don't think 2 or 3 generations ahead. This is what the problem with boomers are, right? Boomers only think about not simply their generation, but they think about themselves, selfishness. And this is the very thing that discredited the aristocracy in the past and is discrediting the political, let's say, acumen, or if you could even call it that, of our political elite today, hence why there is a Caesarian figure in the form of Trump, and I'm sure of those that will follow in his stead, to basically amend this very long-sighted, short-sighted policy. Or, excuse me, far-reaching but short-sighted policy. I'll read again. During the 4th century, when the general interest in great individuals increased and produced the new literary form, biography, its favorite subjects were poets, philosophers, and tyrants. And the 7 wise men who became famous about the beginning of the 6th century included not only lawgivers and poets, but tyrants like Periander and Pittacus. A particularly significant fact is that nearly all the poets of that period lived at the courts of tyrants. Individualism was not yet a general rule, and there was no universal leveling down of the intellect. Individualism still meant true spiritual independence. And for the very reason of the few independent souls sought one another out for mutual support. Pause. Remember, the professor, Werner Jaeger, is a Harvard professor, very good guy. I think he wrote in the 1930s. It's interesting to note that individualism is not actually a positive thing in the sense of what we perceive it to be today. This individualism, as we perceive it, amounts to the automaton of the neoliberal order. What he's talking about is the true individual, the Jungerian, let's say, anarch, right? The great individual man. So this is important. I read again, and this is the most critical part. The concentration of culture at the courts of tyrants had the effect of intensifying intellectual and aesthetic life, not only in the narrow circles of artists and connoisseurs, but throughout the country. Such was the result of the patronage of Polycrates at Samos and Pisistratus in Athens, or Periander in Corinth, and of Hieron in Syracuse, to name only of the most brilliant of the despots. In Athens, we know more details of the tyranny, and we can estimate the full effect on the development of Attica, which was produced by the tyrant's interest in poetry, art, and religion. Their court was the studio of the Anacreon, Simonides, Platinas, Lassus, and Onomakritos. It fostered the beginnings of comic and tragic drama, and of Athenian music, which reached such a high development in the 5th century. It encouraged the great recitations of Homer and incorporated them in the Panentheia, the national festival which Pisistratus so splendidly reorganized. It planned the great festivals of Dionysus and stimulated the practice of the fine arts, sculpture, architecture, and painting. It made Athens what she always remained, a city of the muses. From it flowed a joyful new spirit of enterprise and a finer sense of pleasure. In a dialogue falsely attributed to Plato, Pisistratus' younger son, Hipparchus, is described as the first aesthete, and Aristotle calls him an amorist and a lover of the arts. It was a real tragedy that this gay, politically harmless man should have been struck down by the tyrannicides in 514. Remember, gay meaning in the antiquated sense of happy. While he lived, he was a generous patron to many poets. One of them, Onocrates, repaid his patronage by forging oracular verses in support of the Pisistratid dynasty, and the writing entire epics under the name of Orpheus to suit the court's fancy for mystical religions. The thing became such a scandal that the tyrants were eventually forced to abandon him to popular feeling. He was banished and saw his patrons no more until Hippias joined him in exile. That one scandal does not diminish the services of the dynasty to the cause of literature. Their court was a source of inexhaustible stream of poetry and art which flowed for centuries through the symposia of Athens. They were ambitious to win victories in the chariot race at the great national games, and they supported every form of athletic competition. They provided, in fact, a powerful stimulus to the advance of general cultural life in the life of their time. Some have believed that the great development of religious festivals and the encouragement of all the arts were typical of the Greek tyrannies, were merely stratagems to distract the restless minds of the citizens from political questions and to give them a new but safe interest. So, in other words, they are claiming, some claim, that this was the motive operandi, or the motive for these cultural innovations by the tyrants and their cultivation of this, is to give them bread and circuses, right? This is what the Romans used to do, but this is very much a uncharitable view of the motive behind it. And of course, it's true that there is a utility to these things, political utility, but there are many other ways of skinning a cat, right? So, to my mind, it feels like not simply uncharitable, but in bad faith, and could be easily dispensed with because of the fact that it's with the taste and true unity of a higher ideal that one creates art. And I read again. Even if these motives did play some part in the cultural policy of the tyrant, his deliberate concentration on his task shows that development of art and intellect was meant to be a cultural contribution to the life of the community. It was part of his service to the public, but he showed that he was a true politikos. He brought his subjects to a deeper understanding of the true greatness and value of their city. Public interest in religion and the arts was, of course, not a new thing, but it was suddenly increased to a vast extent when they were systematically cultivated by a rich and powerful ruler. His official encouragement of the cultural activity was a proof of the tyrant's affection for the common people. That duty was later taken over by the democratic state, which merely followed his example. After the work of the tyrants, no state could afford to exist without pursuing a systematic cultural policy. At that period, however, The state's interest in culture was confined to the adornment of religion by the arts and the support of artists by the tyrant. These activities never brought the state into conflict with itself. Dissensions among the state could be created only by poetry, which invaded public life and ideas more deeply than the lyric poets at the tyrant's court ever ventured to do so, or by science and philosophy, which did not then exist at Athens. We never hear that the early tyrants showed any favor to famous philosophers. They concentrated rather on increasing the scope and popularity of the arts and improving the aesthetic and physical standards of the people. End quote. So that's a lot, and I apologize, legionaries, for the extant, let's say, citation I read. I know it's lengthy and it doesn't make for good listening per se, because a lot of this, I mean, it's a massive book, but it's salient, and it gives you a number of different dynamics here. First of all, the history, the background, the justification that I'm going to posit the greatness of Agathocles in the following biography that I'm going to relay to you, legionaries. But before we roll into that, before we roll into the biography, I think it's important that you understand the following. Without high culture is impossible. It's impossible without the attainment of the unity of political power. And as the quote made it plainly clear, without unity, there is no unification of principle culturally, right? Because there is no one impulse of, let's say, taste. And I know this sounds kind of abstract, so let me break it down to you. What is taste, right? Well, taste is something that is kind of, it's not something that you can teach mechanistically. It's something that it approximates to a natural instinct for rhythm in music, per se. Now, of course, this is not a one-for-one analog, but it's not something that you can simply like teach someone. They can maybe ape a very broken kind of cadence to a dance per se, but you will never be able to match the sway of someone who naturally has the let's say elan of a kind of artist, right? Now, the interesting thing about the tyrant Pisistratus specifically was his high taste, because it's not simply enough to be an autocrat, okay? And I'm not making that argument. You have to be also a total human being. And this is the object of Lance's Legion, because for as much as I am here for the legionaries in general and people in general and doing my best to offer what I can and give back more than I took from this world, my main interest is actually cultivating an aristocracy, a leadership, a clique of, let's say, future soldier princes in the vein of Agathocles. And the reason why is because you can do much with, I guess, let's say, the allegory of chiefs and Indians. You can have a bunch of Indians, but they will be a disorganized rabble, and if left to their own devices, they will do what they do in modernity, which is, in effect, a vulgar, low, and basically base instinct for life. Many of the aristocratic impulses that exist in the common people exist there because of an archaic atavism. Atavism being this old infusion into the cultural zeitgeist of the tradition of these people that have latently been part of the tradition of these people, okay? So this is their one kind of redeeming factor, but it's not everything. And this is not to also do the wrong thing, which is to completely have absolute contempt for the hoi polloi. There is nothing wrong with being a follower. There's nothing wrong with, basically anyone at all, so long as they're good dudes pursuing higher things and leavening themselves, being a better man than you were yesterday, better man or woman. And in this case, if you're a legionary, I would even go so far as to say, especially because the niche sentiment, or rather the niche interest of this place, that you are already this cut above. I mean, it takes exceptional let's say, patience to be able to listen to my ramblings over some whiskey and, my ramblings with Sergeant Barnes here, okay? So, at a certain point, it is self-selecting. Now, when I say the unity of the autocracy, like, just to give you a juxtaposition, you could easily be this, like, commie state, right? Like, the DPRK. If any of you have been in the former Soviet bloc or had the misfortune of visiting, let's say, the DPRK, you will notice that a lot of it is very dreary, brutalist sentiment. The architecture itself conveys more than simple utility. They choose brutalism, and the brutalism is awful. And examples of brutalism are, for instance, the library at George Washington University in D.C., the FBI headquarters is a brutalist architecture itself. It does not it doesn't heighten man's instinct for living, right? And that is the utility, so to speak, if we may speak so low of art, is the leavening of the spirit, of élan, to inspire people to do great things. You are what you see, what you give your attention to, right? That's Epictetus, right? And this is a truism. I mean, it's not simply him. I'm sure that you can go to multiple different higher level master civilizations and notice the same things. Which is why, for instance, this apathy to seeing ugly things because of liberty, and again, this is another indictment on liberty itself, is because what happens is most people have bad taste, and so they make bad-looking things, which in their turn cause people to be engendered with or imbibe a bad feeling or a low feeling. We know this for a fact. So, for instance, during the Spanish Civil War, the communists, so it was the communists and the patriots, right? It's just a never-ending battle. But the communists actually had torture chambers which were inspired with Bauhaus. I forgot what it was called. It's not surrealism per se, but it was basically cubism. And it is very dystopian, and because our bodies are organic, our minds are organic, and therefore we naturally seek golden means and basically ratio and proportion. Beauty is a universal truth, and we see the same things play out in high art in all civilizations, despite not having contact with each other, being isolated. So, for instance, the high art of the Koreans, prior to being cinified, the high art of the Japanese, basically during their time of the shogunate, the high art of course, even the Han, for instance, or the Vietnamese, etc., and the Thai, especially. I'd like to add to that. Now, that's part and parcel of why aesthetics matter. There's this weird, false belief in modern times that if you're a real man, you don't care about being pretty, okay? You're a hard guy, okay? You don't care about how you look. This is false. And this is false bravado and dumb. This is like what Hicks think, and Hicks, bless their heart, they're not meant to actually rule society because they get fooled. The only Hicks that I like are the ones that are the gentlemen of the estates, right? The latifundia, like Thomas Jefferson. Look at Monticello. Look at the instincts of men who created their kind of villas in the countryside. These are the only people that actually have the taste requisite. Now, this is not to say, of course, that you have to be those guys to be able to say this. It just means that usually it's a heuristic, right? It's from these people that you can get the highest art. But, and like I said before, in the American sense, there's always, exceptions that prove the rule. So, for instance, Cormac McCarthy, great West Virginia backdoors, Southern boy guy, wrote the most amazing literature, hard-hitting literature that you will ever read. Please read Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. Thank you very much. Oh, and also, by the way, Judge Dredd, the judge never did anything wrong, okay? Judge Dredd, different thing. Freudian slip right there. Now, returning from our little rabbit hole, and hopefully you did not dirty your little fluffy tail down the rabbit hole, and approximating the light, so to speak, I think it's important that we understand that there is no comparison between the democratic spirit and what is height in us, right? What is excellent. The many are by definition mediocre. They're mid, okay? People really need to stop with the peasant worshipping stuff, okay? This is a terrible Spenglerian, Rubish conceit. And it's not to say that I don't love, the backwoods boys, or the people that frequent, the middle class and so on. I myself am part of this exact clique, but we betray ourselves when we let our personal, let's say, fortunes dictate the object of our becoming, the direction of our becoming. Look, I may have been born as middle class, but I damn will be a tyrant of at least a medium-sized tropical country. Trinidad, Tobago, here I come. But in all seriousness, though, do not let who you are today define what you can be tomorrow. Always honor what is high in you and in the world, and when you honor what is highest, you become that thing, okay? Just like you become those things which you honor that is low. Which is why, by the way, mercy is a supreme evil. Because with mercy, what you're doing is you're rewarding weakness, you're rewarding lethargy, you're rewarding loserism. The best thing you can do is tough love, which is honoring what is trying to overcome weakness, even if a person's weak. So, a shrimp or a big fatso that goes to the gym, you honor that he's going to the gym. You don't honor his excuses, okay? You don't keep him, you don't stop the bully siding, okay? But continuing to, in effect, develop this idea of this total Renaissance man as the sovereign, as the necessary prerequisite to higher life, this venerable tradition would go on into the future. And to make my point more kind of fleshed out, because if you look at modern academics, if you listen to their tripes and bullshit about how Athens was culturally rich because of its democratic and free-loving people, that's absolutely false, okay? That's so stupid, because remember, it was Athens that killed Socrates. It was Athens that killed Alcibiades, that was protecting them and advancing the Athenian Empire. It was the people that did that, okay? But when Athens was an oligarchy or, a tyranny under Pisistratus, then it was great. It was only then that things were grand and truly achieving what was most high. And people forget that the Republic by Plato was an exaltation of Sparta. That is what, in substance, in a tactful way of presenting it, for especially Athenian, he could have easily been whacked, just as Socrates had been whacked by the people, that he was actually trying to, let's say, teach what was high and the ideal of Sparta with a synthesis of what Athens was. And what came out of it was, of course, the Republic. Now, let's finally transition to the city of Syracuse. As you had probably heard from the excerpt before, the city of Syracuse has a long history of tyrants, and so did that place of Magna Graecia. Magna Graecia is the region of southern Italy, which today would be what the North would derisively call the Sudolani, but their great Greek impulse, especially during this time, was so profound and so important, it formed part of the greater Hellenic world. And the Hellenic world was so vast, it was incredibly wide. I mean, it didn't just simply span the coasts of the Aegean and the various islands that dot it, but it was as far-reaching as Massilia. Massilia being, of course, Marseille. And rumors, of course, that there were Greek colonies in Ireland. As far-fetched as it may sound, there were tin deposits there, and during the Iron Age, it was one of the most important sources of basically bronze metalworking for finery, for cups, etc. And so there was an economic impulse to do so. But Sicily has always been the gem of the Mediterranean. It is both fertile due to its volcanic ash soil, so it's incredibly rich, and it was the place which the best wine in the Hellenic world at that time was being brewed. And on top of everything else, it was also the site of this very interesting, let's say, ethnogenesis, a binding of the local Sicilian ethne, and, of course, the Greek infusion of an aristocracy. And so there are various different cities, which we'll hear about in due course, but among them that I would like to bring special attention for your personal interest would be Tarentum, right? And also Syracuse, and Messina, and I would say, let's say, Agrigentum. I can't pronounce it correct. That's the Latin term for these cities. These are archaic terms. There are modern cities that are based around the site of these ancient cities, but remember, they're not our one-for-one delineation or lineage, because obviously, as you know, during the Dark Ages, blah, 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 many of these cities became depopulated. They obviously died out over time, just like Rome ebbed severely at a certain point. So, anyway, that's going too far in one direction. Let us focus, then, on Syracuse, this great city, this great gem. Well, to know its past is to know its future, or rather, its contemporary future in the time of the immediate aftermath of the Great War of the Peloponnese. Well, Syracuse was originally a tyranny, constituted as a republic on paper, and then ultimately, during the time of, let's say, I think it was roughly the 350s, Timoleon, who Bronze Age Pervert has done an episode about this, and I have a licensed snippet, which I'll link in the transmission notes below, just to get a background to him, because his story is actually incredibly interesting. It's a tale of heroism and initiative and drive and aggression in the face of long odds and glory, and the outcome of glory and redemption too. But I don't want to give too much away, because let's focus here on Syracuse. And so Syracuse was a very rich city. It was a trading port. Its main focus was, of course, trade. It was placed at this perfect nexus between the Greek world and the Carthaginian Punic world of North Africa, the emerging Roman power, which of course had all the Latin states around it, and the Greek states of the, let's say, the southern Magna Graecia, the Sardinian islands, Corsica, of course, and connection to Gaul. Gaul being the wine from the Burgundy area or region, which is where that city Marseille is currently located. So southern Gaul, and trade routes that basically link all throughout the Mediterranean. This is a city that would continue to be a vital trade port for the rest of its existence, all the way up to the Barbary Wars, and I would say it probably peaked, or rather, not peaked, but it finally had its last vestiges of importance in the time of the, let's say, 1600s, right? So 1650, when Malta finally fell, it was basically disbanded. That was about the time, and for no direct correlation itself to the last of its great wealth, right? At that time, it had become a dominion of the Bourbon, of the cadet branch that ruled the kingdom of Naples and Sicily. And the reason why Syracuse became unimportant was because at that time, the Ottoman Empire was at its height. The realm of the, let's say, Ummah, right? So the Islamic world was extremely hostile to Christian trade, and the North African coast had become infested with Barbary pirates, with basically pseudo-state actors licensed by the Ottoman Empire, and if they weren't licensed, they were marginally allowed, so therefore they were implicated in the piracy activity of the northern coasts by the Ottoman princes, of course, the Sultan. And the challenge was, of course, for the Western Europeans at that time, was to go around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and find alternate routes. Coincidentally, of course, this was one of the major impulses of colonizing the New World. The New World being sought ostensibly to pursue an alternative trade link to India, but if you don't mind me going off on a tangent here, very interesting. There is some secrets or esoteric, or let's say even schizotypic, let's say stories, mythologies of the fact that I think even in ancient times it was known that there was land that was not Asia if one kept sailing west. And I know this sounds kind of far-fetched, but let me explain here a little bit in further detail. The reason why it was impossible to cross the Atlantic was two factors. One, the extremely choppy and difficult, let's say, cross-passage that was necessary. So, like, at that time, especially Mediterranean cultures, the trireme, the bireme, those types of, let's say, naval architecture were not meant for the rough and rocky, let's say, naval environment of the Atlantic. The only people who actually had made any ships that were seaworthy were on the western coast, and these were the Celtic peoples from the Celto-Iberian Peninsula all the way north into, of course, Western Gaul, and the Germanics that were still residing at this time in the Scandinavian Peninsula and the Gotland Island. And, okay, perfect. So we understand that. They were the only ones that were proxy to that, and so stories, which were closely guarded secrets of, for instance, Basque fishermen. It is said that even as early as, I would say, 1100, there were fisheries that the Basque would go out and find and fish and bring back in record time to be able to sell their fisheries back locally in their northeastern region of the Iberian Peninsula, right? So Spain. You should look up where the Basque country is. The Basque people are very interesting, but I'm not going to go there. The secret, though, is that because it was kind of the reason why you don't want to disclose this information is twofold. You don't want competition, and the second one is you don't want your competition to know the many other advantages that that region may possibly proffer. So, for instance, the Americas are incredibly rich in silver specifically and gold. It's likely that some of these Basque fishermen and let's say Celtic seafarers, and even as early as, for instance, let's say Leif Erikson, right? Leif Erikson in the 800s. It said that they went and kind of went all over North America, the Caribbean, and brought back small portions of gold, precious metals, all that kind of stuff, and brought it back, and is one of the secrets to the wealth of very certain cities that were placed along the rim of the Atlantic coast. Very interesting, and there's some studies which I'm not going to find because I'm not really a geologist, but I heard that there were some studies done on the metallurgical endowments of certain ancient cities, over deposits and so on, and their origins are from North America. It's very crazy. They've done some like radioactive testing or something. It's very cool, but I'm not going to get into that. Getting back to Syracuse, remember Syracuse in the 300s was still the center of the world. Its merchantmen traveled all throughout the Mediterranean, and of course those trade lines would go all the way to far-reaching India and eastern China. This is important. The trade and the wealth is important, because where there's wealth, there are people, but also the best people, and the means by which great things can happen, right? So you cannot do great things without at least some semblance of a high density of a motivated, highly capable, highly materially endowed polity. And it was like that which was ripe for action for Syracuse. And previously in its political history, Syracuse, of course, was very much warring. The Greeks of that ancient time were constantly fighting each other, killing each other. Today Syracuse was prevailed over the city of Akragas, and then tomorrow there was neutrality, and then of course there was trade, and then a season later Akragas got the better of Syracuse, and they outmaneuvered them and by leagues and so on, and so there's this back and forth. And because of the nature of the ruling elite being merchantmen, their interest in political power went only as far as it was necessary to secure their personal financial gains. And though, of course, this is natural and this is a materialist explanation for things that you would find in any kind of Marxian academia of geopolitics, that doesn't paint the whole picture. Indeed, one could even say that it's only men with faith and grand visions and dreams that are able to accomplish great undertakings, right? Because without this kind of faith, or without this kind of, let's say, disgust with the mediocre, with the good enough, you'll never want to innovate. You'll never want to exceed your limits, to go beyond the bounds, to achieve beyond the realm of impossible. Plus ultra, right? That great motto of the Spaniards during the 1500s means to go further, right? Well, that's the issue with oligarch types. This is the issue with merchant types. When they're the ruling elite, they're incredibly selfish, they're rapacious, they are very usually vulgar in their tastes, and they don't think in grand terms. They're bean counters, right? They're just really good bean counters. They are really good liars. They know how to manipulate people into buying wares far in excess of their value. And this is exactly where we get capital interest and so on and so forth. I'm not into that. I'm a warrior. I like earning my things, or earning my salt by steel, not silver. But this is the circumstance in which Syracuse was founded. And there's a lesson in that, right? And I'll show you in due course what Agathocles did. But it's interesting to note that at this time it was a highly mercantile society, highly prosperous, capable. And the history from its immediately previous to Agathocles, was the intervention of Timoleon to rescue, first of all, Syracuse from its internal strife, right? There was a lot of personal enmity between the ruling, decrepit elites and the common folk, who were completely predated upon and just basically done dirty, who were rightfully upset. And don't take this as an interpretation of me being a kind of commie, like, oh, the proles are always right. It's like, no, I don't believe that at all. I believe in a certain noblesse oblige, and there can be times when the peasantry and the common folk have rights and have a sense of being taken advantage of, that they can be upset, and they have the mandate to, in effect, overthrow an illegitimate plutocracy, even if in the written letter of the law, just as it was in Syracuse at this time, the ruling elites were also legitimate de jure, even though de facto they had lost the mandate of the polis. So, continuing further, we have finally come to that very cradle of civilization, this very origin, sediment of great undertaking, of the great man titled Strategos Autocrator Agathocles. So that is to translate into English, Supreme Commander, Caudillo, right? Generalissimo. And yes, I believe this. I believe that the president should be ruling the United States from the Pentagon. His title should be Generalissimo, but I cannot say more. They prevent me. They'll come after me. I can't say any more. But going back, Agathocles. How did he start? Where was he born? So, he was the son of the mythic, although there is a lot of conjecture as to who his mother was and of what origin. There are some stories that his mother was actually a Punic descendant, Punic being Carthaginian, so this is a Semitic people from the Orient. So these are Phoenicians that had, that's the story of Carthage, by the way, is that Phoenicians that were based in modern-day Lebanon went over and colonized northern Africa, and this was the ethnic origin of his mother, allegedly so, and his father was a certain Carcinus of Rhegium. Now, he was a Greek, and eventually speaking, and because his father had this proclivity, and remember, during this time, the greatest, let's say, dialectic that was going on was this very same thing that caused the Peloponnesian War, or at least philosophically speaking, is the idea of democracy, vice, oligarchy, in the terms of Thucydides, of course. And the father of Agathocles, named Carcinus of Rhegium, was ultimately one of these guys who is possible was exiled from Rhegium with his city because he was a proponent of the counter-elite of that city for democratic purposes, and so he was cast out, sent to Thermae, and at Thermae, his wife bore him a son, Agathocles, but there is a story that Agathocles, or it came to him in a dream, and dreams, remember, the ancients believed dreams were God-sent and divine, especially if they were intelligible, especially if they were pretty straightforward, right? And it came as a sign that his son would ultimately kill him. And so what he decided to do was expose the child. What is exposure? Exposing children in ancient Greece, and this is the tradition that you probably heard from the 300s of Sparta, but you can read about it in Plutarch. But it's this idea that if you have an unwanted newborn, if he was either physically deformed or he was born out of wedlock in the sense that, your wife was walking around with other men, so to speak, well, you can always put him on a hillside and, in effect, either by the elements or by starvation and lack of water, kill the child, or, as was commonly understood, usually some peasants would come up, take pity, and raise them. This is the story of course, Hercules. This is the mythic story of Hercules, but this is the also mythic story of the twin brothers of Romulus and Remus, who were exposed at birth, allegedly, who were the sons of gods, and who had been cared for and suckled. This is where the insignia of Rome comes from, the she-wolf suckling two children, Romulus and Remus, to health, until finally there was a family from the Aventine that raised them. And finally, of course, there's that story that would go on to make the greatest history, the greatest city, and the greatest people the world has ever known. And I unironically believe that the trajectory of the world is defined by Rome. We are Roman, okay? We just forgot it. We just are in denial a little bit, okay? We have a different name, but we are Roman. But going back, of course, this is the kind of mythic origin of Agathocles, but it did actually happen. He was actually exposed, but after 3 days and of literally being alone in the wilderness by himself as an infant, he was so physically strong that through the privations, he was actually taken pity by, again, another peasant family that raised him to a certain age, and to his mother, who was forced by her husband to expose the child, obviously took great interest in the raising of her kids by this, obviously family. And so for many years passed until roughly, I think he was 7, 8, or 9. And he was extremely robust of body. This was the first attribute, his first virtue, his first excellence, right? His natural-born instinct. Just as Odysseus would say that the gods give us gifts and we alone can play with them, some of us were given more gifts than others. Some of those gifts are particular. Some are more dynamic. Some are great of wit. Others are great of body and strength. Others have the strength of oratory or beauty, and so on. Well, Agathocles was, of course, a handsome guy, but his defining feature was his strength. And I'll go into it in the future, but I would even go so far as to suggest, in a Nietzschean sense, that his physical robustness, his stature, his strength, and his willpower were all interrelated, right? And I think this is what was necessary. Syracuse needed a monster of will to be able to lift itself and
ultimately throw itself like a javelin of destiny into the future, into greater horizons, and this is what Agathocles did. But returning to the story, it came to the point some years later that his father, Corsinus, had this, I guess, breakdown. He felt extremely guilty for having done so, and he was just so, like, absolutely, like, destroying himself over it with guilt, that he regretted it highly, that he thought about his exposed son for a very long time. And luckily enough, his mother says, well, that's great, because he's actually alive, by the way, and he's being raised by this other family. I just haven't told you because that's freaking psycho. You know, you killed our kid for what? But he's obviously elated, and so they're very happy. Which is hell of a story, by the way. That's some crazy Saturnine, Cronus, child-eating stuff, but interesting story of origin. Ultimately, it was his father that taught him his trade being a potter. Now, for those of you who are modernists who don't know what a potter really is, it's more than simply being like, oh, I like making clay like things like you did at high school or some artisanal crap. No. Back in the day, the main way or vessel with which you could store perishables, that you could transport great things, was through the use of amphorae. And amphorae are these massive industrial-sized urns, right? And they're extremely important. And of course, there are artisanal guys that were more kind of artists that were creating things more for the aesthetic value of it rather than the utility of it. But it is interesting to note that the Greeks even adorned their more utilitarian items. They made sure it was beautiful. The Greeks always had this very, very venerable tradition of making everything beautiful. Even the mundane, they found glory in it, or they glorified it and exalted life in that way. This is why Greece, when we look back in Greece, it was just this beautiful, white stone cityscape studying the Aegean. Just an absolutely beautiful people with a beautiful heart. Anyway, going back, this is obviously physically demanding work. I mean, truly physically demanding. I mean, you have to... It's not simply the physical size of the amphorae, which is heavy clay, but you have to fire clay, right? You have to put this in massive furnaces. And so exposure to this kind of hard labor from an early age, no doubt, made him 10 times stronger and helped develop him more fully in his body. Now, he was given some semblance of an education. It wasn't said that he was necessarily some kind of extremely low-born kind of guy. It wasn't like he was a very mean kind of favela dweller. That's not what is implied here. His dad probably owned an industry and worked side by side with a team of either slaves or servants in addition to his son. So it was kind of something like a medium to small-sized business. They were relatively wealthy, and so they had the means by which they could offer their children an education, right? And that education being, of course, Homer, philosophy, some semblance of mathematics, but most importantly, and we'd come to find out this, that finally at Thermae they decided to depart for Syracuse, Syracuse being the preeminent city on the horizon. It was taking in colonists from all across the Greek world. This was in no small part due to the fact of Timoleon. Timoleon had wanted to not simply conquer back Syracuse and secure her politically in the near term from Carthage, which was what was encroaching on the Sicilian island, but he also wanted to infuse and invest in the physical polity itself. That means the people. That means also every segment of society. And he gave new laws and enshrined new elites. And so, for a time being, there was no political strife, and because of his personal, let's say, leadership ability, his ability to reconcile, especially because he was a foreigner, right? The interesting thing is they saw him as supremely unbiased, and he was one of these rare men, Timoleon, who was truly a just man. He wasn't one of these characters that usually come out of Sparta. For whatever reason, whenever a Spartan leaves Sparta by himself, he just goes absolutely apeshit. He just becomes a drunkard, obsessed with, wealth and gold and finery, because for some people, constitutionally speaking, they have an instinct for these things, and when they're repressed for a long time arbitrarily, just like in Sparta, it just goes crazy. It's kind of like an Amish guy who goes to New York City for the first time during his year-long exposure to the outside world. Well, some of those guys go absolutely nuts. They do like crazy drugs, like opium, meth, like just banging people, just doing crazy stuff, and they lose their way. And the interesting thing about Timoleon is that he never lost his composure. He never lost his sense of justice or leadership. And remember, these are one of the main leadership traits that in the Marine Corps, I always bring it up. JJ did tie buckle, right? Justice, judgment, dependability, etc. Well, justice is absolutely essential. Having that integrity is absolutely essential, and is the very essence of what made Syracuse again regain its wealth and power in its regional vicinity that came to eclipse its prior, let's say, status as a, let's say, preeminent or leading city in the Hellenic world. So zooming back to Alcibiades and the progression of his career, roughly at the age of 15 or 16, he signed up and became part of the military for a military career of the Syracusan polity. It was really cool. And what's really interesting about that fact is that even back in ye olden days, where the average age was a lot younger and the age for being an adult was still the same. So, for instance, when legions in the Roman Empire were raised, they usually waited for recruits that were of age, which to them was, I think, 20 or something, or approximating that age. And what's interesting as a corollary is that special forces in the United States, statistically speaking, select for men in their late 20s because of the fact, for some reason, your body is more resilient and developed than you would be in your early 20s. Now, this is kind of interesting on a physiological standpoint, but what I'm trying to explain to you is that the young age of Agathocles having signed up and been found worthy of joining the ranks, even as an enlisted man, should speak volumes as to his physical robustness, okay? To say nothing, of course, of his reputation of bearing the heaviest spear, the heaviest armor, the heaviest shield that his fellows could not even pick up, apparently. So he was truly a titanically strong Herculean type of man. And I don't know, I wanted to just kind of reflect on that, because beyond simply the fact that, like, great men are great men for their intellect, and of course, Agathocles, I'm just going to call him, I don't know, Agatha. Nah, I'm going to do Agathocles, but dang, it's a mouthful. Maybe I need some more drink. But in all reality, though, Agathocles was clearly a very willful and intelligent person. I mean, you simply have to be at a certain level. You can't just be a silly little guy and somehow meander your way to absolute power and outfox many, let's say, worthy adversaries on an international level. But to primarily make his shoe in the door, it was actually his physical strength that lent itself to his bearing, his command presence. And this is huge, especially in reflection of the military culture and military leadership. There are too many stories of how, no, you can be a leader too, you can do this and that, and your physical body does not command the respect. And somehow we have, I guess, maybe put on airs of a false nobility, the false noble lie, where that men don't judge people based on the cover of a book, right? Well, we absolutely do, and there's an efficacy to that, because who you appear physiologically is who you are really on the inside. It's a manifestation of your inner person. And to say nothing, of course, is it instills confidence in the rank and file when you are the physical embodiment of the ideal. Especially as a soldier, you're supposed to be effusing an ideal of strength, vigor, basically solidness, right? And a kind of commanding presence which goes beyond simply having gravitas or a pathos of a lawyer. It has to be something deeper than that. And, of course, there's something to be said about going too far, where you look like a brute, you look like a simpleton. But it seems to me, from the accounts of, basically all the ancient accounts, which are a score of them, it seems to me that the physical body of Agathocles was complemented by a certain aesthetic quality which he brought to the table, a kind of commanding presence of a higher station, which no doubt led to his upward trajectory. And so, going through his career, what was interesting is that, in his young age, he obviously made a name for himself as a preeminent and cream of the crop hoplite. During one of the great battles, some of the commanders had fallen with a in the conflict with a unnamed regional power. I think it was like one of these other city-states that had a league of their own, an army of their own. And so the officer of their battalion or regiment had fallen, and so he was able to put himself as a candidate and came under the patronage of the aristocratic clique, which we're going to now, is called the 600. The 600, and I'll go in further detail later, is the best way to explain oligarchy, right? Because for as much as we consider oligarchy as kind of a cabal, the best way to explain it is that merchant societies tend to give certain families or individuals a certain kind of fief in economic activity. And of course, they'll never bind with each other, and so it naturally lends itself to creating a collegial type of government that is not an autocracy. You don't see merchant autocracies, but you often see merchant oligarchies, which in their more depraved form becomes a plutocracy or a kleptocracy, right? These are kind of semantics, but it's important for you to understand. And back in the day, to be a ruling elite, you had to have noble blood or at least noble patronage. And so this is vital here. This is exactly where Agathocles gets his first in to the possible route, the warpath to ultimate power. He gets the commission because of a friend who is deeply connected with the 600, and it is through that connection that he was able to then, in a series of campaigns further into the future, become captain of the guard, so the elite unit, the elite standing force of the city of Syracuse. This is significant because remember, in the city-state era, even though it had been the case that Alexander the Great, during his time contemporaneously, was conquering all the known world to the east, and doing it on the back of a professional force that mirrors the pattern of Imperial Rome, the general modus operandi of the Greek city-states was still the archaic militia call to arms, where the citizen was a citizen precisely because he bore the duty of military service and therefore found his franchise, or at least enhanced privileges, which gave him some edge in the law courts, in tariffs, etc. And so this was part of civic duty, and coincidentally, or not coincidentally, this is also where we get a lot of our citizen soldier ideology in the early American Republic, that Thomas Jefferson was obviously a Hellenophile, and he referenced much from ancient Greece. But I go too far. The significance that he was part of the standing force, which, remember, was an uncommon thing when, in an era where calling up forces for specifically campaigns was the norm, and the rest of the time you were a civilian. For him, he had become a full-time regular soldier, and with that came, obviously, access to the highest echelons of power, and obviously connections of his own. And so this is where he comes into those connections. He gets the kind of friendship of certain leading oligarchs that have democratic inclinations. he also starts to do the very interesting Napoleonic thing, is conspire. He conspires to set up Syracuse as a democracy, and a meaningful one at that. So he was a true believer in democracy in the vein of Athens, not during Pericles, but really when, Athens was ruled by an absolute democracy. Like, he was truly galvanized by this animating force, no doubt informed by his father, and he was discovered. Some of the oligarchs that had commiserated with him were executed, and just by his own guile alone, he fled. And interesting story is that en route and departure from the city, he knew that the oligarchs had set up a trap on the street or the road north, and so what he chose to do is take one of his servants who looked exactly like him, dressed him up in his clothing and his armor, and let him go, kind of like a bait way in front of him. And so when the ambush party of the oligarchs fell upon him and slew his servant, he made his getaway and used it as a misdirection to keep them busy. And for that reason, we start to see the legend of Agathocles come into crystal form. Remember, the ancient world is very, what texts we have that survive from that time are few and far between, and comparatively, of course, to the modern age of information, where they're just simply titanic sums of every facet of every event that's ever happened. In the ancient world, especially when he was lesser known, when he was not necessarily a political actor, especially in his childhood, much of it is contested. It's murky and mystical, to say nothing, of course, that some scholars have actually put forth the theory that his legend of his father abandoning him at birth and later being, basically met up with these individuals was an entire fabrication used to legitimize his claim later in life as he became the sole tyrant of Syracuse. And remember, at this time, tyranny just simply denotes the rule of one through unconstitutional means. It had been completely shorn, or hadn't grown this kind of negative antipathy or negative baggage that comes with the word tyranny. Anyway, going back, so some time passes. He is basically wandering the wilderness of Magna Graecia. He heads over to the city called Croton, another place that is ruled by the oligarchic pattern faction. He is in their employ for a while, becomes suspect, is thrown out again. Very interesting things, but then was finally involved in some intrigue back home in Syracuse to establish a democracy. And he was successful. Interesting enough, he was actually successful, which is pretty crazy. And so, but of course, here is the kind of interesting part about his dynamism, his changing, his becoming into who he is, and reveals to us all what it is that makes man man, or at least great men, right? And much in the same way that the absolute terror of the Jacobins was superseded by the autocracy, the popular Caesarism of Napoleon, something similar was happening here, where because his power wasn't that of a monarch, and because he was obviously a man of power and wanted to be in at least some kind of active role, agent role in the sovereignty of the city, he became disaffected. More thoroughly or further going, the oligarchs that had been previously displaced by the Syracusans in their reform, their democratic reform, sought the solace, support, and alliance, military support and alliance, with the Carthaginians, who controlled roughly half to a third of the Sicilian island on the western side. With the Carthaginian aid, under Hamilcar, the democracy is demolished, and Agathocles is once again roughing it somewhere in the countryside with an elite corps of his friends, some retainers, And it is here that I think he starts to have a kind of revelation or an apotheosis of who he's going to become. And this person developed while he was considering what was happening at Syracuse under the power of the oligarchs who are now the puppets of the Carthaginians. This interesting dynamic of what happened, first of all, awakened him to the real outcomes of his previously idealistic means. He recognized that the democracy was incapable of actually responding effectively to the intrigues of the oligarchs, and it certainly wasn't, it wasn't popular. He couldn't forge alliances with adjacent city-states that could have helped him, that could have defended Syracuse with him, joined banners, which is even more interesting because of the fact that the Greeks, being ethnically different by a large margin to the Punics, who were invading and puppeting one of their fellow city-states in their oikoumene, clearly underscored the absolute fact, that democracy wasn't viable in his geopolitical system, or at least his situation, and on top of that, it wasn't gratifying to his personal, let's say, aspirations. It was definitely getting in the way, and on top of everything else, it was just simply unpopular. It wasn't as popular as he had anticipated, and so the depth of his rule wasn't as wide and full as the previous oligarchy had been. So there you go. And, to say nothing, of course, of the inherent unwieldiness of democracy, he just basically had this time in the wilderness, a kind of, let's say, Homeric Jesus wanders in the desert moment. Maybe I guess you could call it an Odyssean kind of voyage, where he turns to a period of time where he's raising, recruiting, selling his services as a mercenary to different city-states until finally, through intrigue and daring and no small amount of balls, he actually overthrows the oligarchy by a very interesting kind of intrigue. Now, listen here. During the time that Hamilcar, representing the Carthaginians, had placed the 600 back into power, he came to understand that back at home, Carthage was also an oligarchy, but it had a senate and so on, and so there's always division, there's always rivalry, and similar to the Greek world, there were factions that represented the commons, and there were factions that represented the interests of the aristocracy. And so what happened was that he had to redeploy west. He left the oligarchs in charge. The oligarchs, who felt that the polity that they were governing was, let's say, upset that they were under the suzerainty of the Carthaginians, was basically being impelled to attack Carthage, to break the oath of protection they had given to Hamilcar upon their, let's say, rethroning in the city. Having done so, however, Hamilcar realized what was happening, and so threw in his lot with Agathocles. And Agathocles, who by this time had this massive military just sitting in the countryside, there had already been some skirmishes between himself and the Carthaginians, and of course between the Syracusans and the Carthaginians, in effect chose to do something very wily and foxy of him. He chose to, on his part, reconcile the oligarchs of the Syracusans and Agathocles' command himself. Agathocles secured himself a much high position, an archon of some kind. But here's the funny thing. On some fateful evening, what he chooses to do is he invites them to what is called a symposium, or it's really kind of an arena, but for the cultural arts, so it's very much enclosed, and he invited all the leading citizens of the 600 into that little arena. Upon their visitation, his soldiers surreptitiously encircle the entire building,
close all the gates, and then systematically start slaughtering all of them in this kind of Game of Thrones intrigue, just blood everywhere, just gushing and just rivers of blood, and the Syracusans were thrown into an uproar. The average people understood this as a kind of cue to take out their grudges, and of course with the breakdown of law and order, this happens everywhere. Breakdown of discipline invites chaos, because even though he had the intention of using this chaos for a very specific objective, there are citizens within the city who would use this as a way or a means to settle old scores with people who have nothing in common or nothing connected with the action being sought. So Agathocles gives the command for the, not simply the military, but the citizens that were part of his faction to just absolutely seek out the families of these leading citizens and annihilate them as well. But there is, of course, great slaughter, a lot of collateral damage, or at least, the unintended collateral damage resulting from this. And only 3 days later was he able to actually have some kind of semblance of law and order, upon which he is acclaimed Autocrator, or Strategos Autocrator, which means absolute commander of the city. This is technically a temporary title that in times of war was a way of appointing a commander-in-chief to make sure there was a unity of command in the field, but this temporary title came to become a permanent one for him. And because of the fact that the constitution of the Syracusans was not a monarchy, it was technically illegitimate. But, as I had said before, in my opinion, personal opinion, the oligarchs had already lost the mandate of their people, of their city, and to say nothing, of course, of the fact that the constitution that the city had found itself legislated was contrived and new. It had nothing to do with the natural state of what Syracuse was. Syracuse, for a long time, had been a tyranny. And I think the name was Phaleris. I forgot exactly the name, but he set a strong precedent for a succession of strong men to rule. And even though it didn't garner any kind of kingship or kingly family, just like the Agonids or the I forgot what their name was, but the twin families of Sparta, because Sparta had two kings who ruled in succession to one another, in parallel to one another, legitimately. Of course, this was not the case in Syracuse, and so the character of Syracusan political culture had always been that of autocracy, even if it had been the case that they weren't technically legitimate in the legalese sense. But like I said before, this is a vile legalism. What is true is what people want from the nation, right? The nation is the ultimate command. And to be frank with you, the national will is greater than the sum of its parts, right? It has nothing to do with winning an absolute majority of the various different ciphers that compose of that city. Rather, it is an abstract concept, a kind of divine right which lands in the hands of those who are excellent and worthy, and the gods bless with victory those who are worthy. Agathocles was, of course, one of those men. A brief pause, though. As shocking as it may be, and I'm not personally too shocked, I think that, the kind of targeted assassinations and liquidation of your enemies is eminently politically not simply expedient, but also it makes sense. It's the only way to actually consolidate your rule, and this is the only way that you're able to actually do things. Like, remember, Machiavelli said the following, that ultimately either you treat an enemy extremely well, or you destroy him. For if you cause him rancor or cause him injury and do not annihilate him, he will always have recourse to destroy you. To say nothing, of course, that these people already had the interest of everything against which he stood for. So they weren't on board anyway, and so he felt this. Agathocles, unfortunately, had engendered to himself a certain reputation for rapacity
He was known for his quickness and temper. That is to say, he was known to become a very, in the words of the ancients, Diodorus Siculus, to switch to a very soldierly, vicious, unforgiving kind of anger, which you never knew when you're going to set off. At some point, he was basically going to pull an Aaron Hernandez on your ass, right? But at the same time, conversely, he was kind of very much had a dichotomy of character, in which that he was actually very warm. He approached citizen body individuals, citizens, and greeted them as equals, or at least in amicable terms. Of course, he came under guard, but everyone does. But the interesting thing is that quickly following the absolute annihilation of the 600, or rather the vast majority of them, because some of them do escape, and they escape guessing who, Hamilcar, well, basically everyone approves of his actions. They're welcoming of him. They enjoy the fact that Agathocles was championing the interests of the Syracusan, not simply the people, but the city, with aims of aggrandizing its power and also, let's say, giving itself retribution against the Carthaginians, who were arch enemies and seen as the ultimate object of ethnic animus. If we are to pause here in this political equilibrium of Agathocles as the sovereign of Syracuse at this moment, we're able to understand his position. Having completely extirpated the oligarch class and basically driven off whatever remnants were left to basically cower in the court of Hamilcar, Hamilcar looked to all of this and shrugged. He had a lot of problems at home. There's a lot of infighting in the Carthaginian Gerousia, right? That was the Senate. And then, conversely, it was understood that Agathocles would keep his word of honor. And even though for the meantime this was true, we will soon find out the foxy, or rather unrighteous and dastardly quality of Agathocles, which had earned him a very ignoble reputation for the rest of humankind. And even though, of course, I am singing his songs, I really cannot gloss over some of these crimes, because gosh dang, they're pretty heinous. I'm not gonna lie. I have a strong stomach myself. I like to style myself as a tougher guy, and but I've got to tell you, this guy will put you through a loop. But anyway, returning, Agathocles takes this time, this newly found equilibrium, this law and order, his unity of power, to enact a series of events, or rather financial excising taxes, with the purpose of building warships, furnishing weapons, supplies, training for soldiers and hoplites, mercenaries, for information and mapping of the entire Sicilian coast, and that of North Africa, to say nothing, of course, of buying and bribing spies all throughout the northern campaign, or the northern area of the Carthaginian homeland. And as we'll see, we'll take this period of time of remilitarization and studded with brief campaigns where he would take Syracuse and its armies and its allies to assert new dominance and to bind to himself all the satellite smaller cities that surrounded him, until finally, of course, he arrived at Akragas. Akragas is this city of wealth as well, on the southern coast of Sicily, but it was getting dangerously close to the Carthaginian-held territories, to say nothing that Hamilcar had been peering across the Mediterranean with weariness in the last year and a half of his campaigning, and seeing Agathocles steadily and surely build his political base militarily, economically, and diplomatically. And so, finally, he arrives at the city, and he sets a siege onto the city, and the Carthaginians set out a fleet with a massive army, a professional army, composed, of course, of Carthaginian heavy infantry, which, by the way, the Carthaginians were no mere
small threat, right? They were no fly. Though they were primarily a mercantile people, they did have the money and the furnishing for war, and they had the habits of levying a citizen body, in addition to, of course, what the Carthaginians are known to do historically. And as you'll see with Hannibal later in history, they would really raise a lot of local levies, whether that's in North Africa amongst the Numidian tribes, or in Greece they would take Greek soldiers and so on, and so bolster their army. Until finally Hamilcar arrives with his host of roughly 50,000 soldiers near the surrounds of Acragas, and arrives to relieve the force and counterattack Agathocles, who had set and invested his forces to reduce the city to his power. It was at this time that Agathocles ended up reassessing the situation, right? The battlefield, the battle space is always dynamic, it's fluid, and when the, let's say, balance of forces do not favor you, there's nothing wrong with, let's say, not retreating, but attacking a different direction. Shout out to Chesty Puller. No, but in all seriousness, though, he assessed the situation as it was developing, realized that the Greek city that he had basically made an investment to, combined with the Carthaginian forces at hand, would have given the enemy a local superiority in numbers and strength. And on top of everything else, of course, the huge morale effect of being outnumbered is no small feat. Back in the day, no less than today, men on the battlefield obviously want to feel as though they're either strong in numbers or strong in training, right? Strong in capability. They were facing down a capable foe who outnumbered them, who were motivated to fight, especially those that were within the city of Acragas. They obviously were fighting for home and hearth. If the city had been taken, there would have been a general massacre, as would happen generally speaking in the ancient world. And so had Agathocles committed his forces, he would have been creating or committing a great blunder. Because what he would have been doing, especially back then, you basically muster all the forces available to march and do military actions. Especially the Agathoclean Greek League, there weren't that many hoplites. There weren't that many soldiers ready to be able to take the fight to the enemy. To say nothing, of course, that the reserves that would have come from those that had stayed home. And to give you reference, it's really important, especially back in the day, that warfighters were physically fit, mentally tough, generally robust, young. Those were the ones that you would take out to campaign. Usually it's the very young or the very old veterans, or the too young to actually participate in military actions abroad, which would create or provide the garrison of the cities back home. Because remember, you can't just leave your, take all your forces with you when you have to make sure that you're setting security on all the assets and cities that you have to take care of on a strategic level. Now, this was very smart, and there are a number of different kind of turns of diplomacy and warfare that take place before the Battle of Himera. Okay, so we're going to zoom forward a year and a half. It was through this time that Agathocles had been maneuvering both diplomatically and also militarily, but he simply could not shake Hamilcar and his forces. And remember, Hamilcar is just a deft, capable, energetic, industrious leader, commander of men. He was truly someone that you could actually aspire to as a good leader, and is one of these few rare military geniuses that exist in the world. Him and Hannibal are absolutely my favorites of the Punic peoples. Very interesting situation. But Agathocles understood that he had met his match. He knew the enemy and he knew himself. He knew his capabilities. He knew the capability of his men and their limitations. And so what he decided to do was wait, bide his time, and then reassess and take a different city called Gela.
It was towards his advance, or en route to his advance, that the Carthaginian, host had intercepted him. It was at Himera, in the very near surrounds of that city, which is on the volcanic slopes of this kind of countryside, just to give you kind of a visual representation of what the battlefield would look like. If you can imagine, and if you can obviously search for images of this, is probably better, but if you're just relying on your mind's eye, think of an arid coastline dotted by orchards of olives and basically fruits, in addition to here and there patches of arable farmland. The rough terrain also wasn't completely flat like a field. It was more of a kind of constant dips and turns of a ravine, very kind of difficult to navigate, and this has a special effect on the military deployment in a battle line formation, because what that kind of does, it interrupts the formation of the phalanx, especially of the infantry. This is kind of where Agathocles chose to beat the enemy of the Carthaginians under Hamilcar. Just taking a pause here, I know I'm giving a lot of background, but it's necessary, otherwise you won't understand what is going to come next. What happened is, in effect, back in the day, we think of set-piece battles as the trademark of ancient warfare. We think that all the battles in the field are those that would characterize, generally speaking, what a war would characterize as. But the vast majority of battle or warfare or combat actually existed in a skirmishing kind of mode. Whether it was the scouts who were on horseback, or what was called ultimately peltasts for the Greeks, what they would go is go forward, forage, hunt, and sometimes they would reconnoiter, of course, way ahead of the column, the main body, and either they would go hunting, or if it were the case that they came across the enemy, they would probably throw a javelin here and there, throw a sling with a rock, here and there, get a couple kills here and there, small, limited engagements where 10 to 20 men on both sides would take part of, and then, of course, flee. These ambuscades and kind of bush wars characterize and are never remarked about unless it had special significance in the lead-up to a set-piece battle. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because this is ultimately how the set-piece battle would come to be. So think about it this way. Agathocles was advancing. The Carthaginians were countering to intercept. They met in a place that was around the target city that Agathocles had marched out to conquer. The skirmishers in the previous days had basically come into contact, and in ever-increasing numbers of entanglements, they basically day after day began to increase the intensity of combat operations. Until finally, of course, there was one day where the Carthaginians were drawing water from a stream, and the Greeks had come across them and set an ambush against them, to which the Carthaginians basically beat a hasty retreat. He noticed that the enemy campsite, right, the baggage train, this is where the logistical end of a host is, right? So it's not simply men with spears and shields and, the Balearic slingers and the archers and the cavalrymen, but remember everything also else that sustains a, let's say, military force in the field for protracted periods of time. This includes, especially back then, slaves, servants, camp followers, technicians, engineers, prostitutes. It's a whole city. It's almost like a little town that accompanies both hosts, all hosts of the ancient world. And in fact, it was only with the Roman legionaries and the Marian reforms that the logistical wagon came to be entirely militarized. What am I saying by this? That ultimately not every single, let's say, individual who is accompanying a host is necessarily a combatant. Now, when it was that the Greeks had come across the Carthaginians and set them to flight and saw that their
campsite was relatively unguarded and that the men-at-arms were unprepared and were alarmed, were scurrying here and there to gather their weapons and set up in battle formation, Agathocles chose what any good commander would do, take the initiative and exploit this opening. This was great. And what ended up happening was the two battle lines met. Whatever little number of the host of the Carthaginians that were ready met the overwhelming host of the Greeks. And it's funny because every city-state, or let's say civilization, past and present, has a reputation, especially in the military forces, for what they're good at, what they're bad at, and etc. And the Greeks were very well renowned for being great heavy infantrymen. And so, of course, not only did they make short work of the Carthaginians simply because they outnumbered them, but because they outfought them in every way. And here is where the interesting tides and fortunes of battle turn. Once he had set the Carthaginian line to flight, what ended up happening was that his men broke discipline because they wanted to break into the baggage train to get their loot. That's another aspect that we don't really know about, but basically back then it was the case that if you were able to fell a foe and you were able to get in his baggage train, people would just go absolutely nuts. I mean, even back then, soldiers weren't paid that much, and they were expected to ameliorate their financial situation by loot, by, in effect, rightful loot. We think of loot in our day, looting and stuff, as a kind of explicitly and singularly criminal activity, but back then it was tradition and normal, in fact part of the attraction of waging war, that one would enrich oneself by stripping the enemy of his wealth, right? And there's something noble in that. But the issue is that they lose their discipline, they break formation, they kind of lose their minds, they drop their weapons, they kind of try to grab all these gold coins and all these nice little accoutrements and tactfully acquire some nice fair maidens that were among the baggage train. But Hamilcar had presaged this, and an eerie silence had descended upon the Greek host until they realized that it was in fact a trap. Hamilcar, a shrewd, foxy desert guy, knew that this was the, let's say, MO of the Greeks, who would break their formation in search of loot after a victorious battle, and if he had offered them the bait of the wealth of his host, that he would induce them to a lower protective posture. They would lose their discipline. And so it is upon this moment that he set his trap, and he sprung it. And just when everyone realized what had happened, a new body of ready-armed, ready to in waiting Carthaginian hoplites resumed the attack, drove the Greeks out of the baggage train. Simultaneously, in a pincer movement, the Carthaginians surrounded or attempted to surround and ran down a large number of the Greek force in their hasty retreat. Remember that in ancient battles, the majority of casualties inflicted are usually in the retreat. When you break the battle formation, or the kills that you make during the pitch of battle, they're actually the vast minority of casualties which are exacted in a conflict, in a combat situation. It's actually when the hoplites or the host turns tail and runs that the majority of killing happens. And so Hamilcar understood that once a formation, a military unit, breaks discipline, breaks ranks, completely loses where their unit leader is, where the battalion commander is, where their officers are, where it is that they should be forming up on, it's very difficult to again regain that kind of ready battle stance. And so this is what Hamilcar was betting on, and he bet magnificently. Ultimately, Agathocles manages to escape with his life. He incurs almost 30 to 40% casualties, whether they're wounded or killed, and those that are wounded and survive the battle, interestingly enough, and because
of the almost malevolent and barbaric culture of the Carthaginians, they ultimately take prisoner and crucify the wounded in the most gruesome and gratuitous way that was completely unheard of in the Greek world, who comparatively were mild. This is not to say, of course, that there wasn't some kind of bloodlust and that something is unique in the ancient world. It was more that even back then, in that bloody setting of the Iron Age, that what the Carthaginians endeavored to do and had almost the stomach and fortitude to do such barbaric things to those that they had taken prisoner, that incurred also a massive morale shock. Being soundly beaten, Agathocles, showing his generalship and commandership and his leadership, basically par excellence in the Hellenic world, manages to not simply reorganize his army to beat back any further counterattacks from the Carthaginian host, but also leaven their morale. So much so that he didn't even have to worry that there would be mass desertions. Because that is quite another thing, too. Desertions are a massive factor regarding enemy attrition and combat operations. Throughout the operational science and art of the ancient Iron Age world, most of what an enemy sought to do was sow shocks of morale. The reason being, of course, is that though it may be beneficial to attrit the enemy through obviously hostile, kinetic combat situations, it actually helps dissolve the enemy force when desertions happen, because what ends up happening is the morale of the overall army takes a hit, the self-esteem and resolve to fight and resist and continue is basically undercut. And so even if it's the case that a sizable majority of the host manages to keep that discipline together and not join any deserters, any battle that would be waged pitch against the enemy that had incurred this kind of morale shock would be at a significant disadvantage, because the men would have no confidence in themselves since they didn't have confidence in their fellows. It was this kind of mutual trust that underpinned the cohesion of a host, of the battalion, and of the units, and the trust between officers and men. So the fact that Agathocles was able to not simply rescue the day and not suffer a total defeat, because that is entirely possible, but was able to actually make sure that his whole army was continuously self-supporting and cohesive, that is a feat in itself. Now, obviously, every commander knows you don't seek to be the best commander in retreat. You seek to be the best commander in attacking and winning and scoring victories. But there is something to be said about the generalship of retreat under fire, or rather, to be retreating in good order under enemy assault and enemy pressure. This is kind of interesting as a small aside, though. You know Mark Antony, the guy that fell in love with Cleopatra? The funny thing is that though he was genuinely popular with the people, he was actually a pretty mediocre commander. And the only times that he actually had scored tremendous triumphs, victories that he had been acclaimed for, were actually victories he had won as a rearguard action, after having been beaten in an operation or a series of battles prior in pitched battles. So, Mark Antony, same thing. He was just very good at keeping the men morale high. He was infectious with his optimism, sober optimism, mind you, and in a kind of manly men's man kind of situation was able to galvanize his force to keep their discipline and cohesion together, and to keep that kind of focus of military discipline, which is one of those absolutely mission critical centers of gravity of any military force on any battlefield of any time. And so it's interesting because it's one of those things that's so difficult to do, and it's hard to even get a feel for when you're actually interacting with these kind of soldiers and so on. But I get beyond the point. Agathocles returns Syracuse is obviously distressed. They're worried that Agathocles will ultimately, I don't know, do something crazy. He will take his anger out on the populace, but actually there's this upswell of support and almost like a kind of heroic defiance against the mutual ethnic foe of the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians are almost like the French to the British, or let's say, let's see. Who else in ancient history has a huge feud? Man, there are just so many, aren't there? The Portuguese and the Spaniards and so on and so forth. But it's a recurring pattern that he was able to leverage that popular support, so retained his legitimacy, his political stability, the strategic imperative of keeping the integrity of his home country together. His basically war effort did not suffer too much, and it was seen as if the casualties and disaster that had been visited upon the Greeks weren't visited upon Agathocles himself, but rather it was almost like a galvanizing force which called forth greater energy to rectify the disgrace of defeat and to secure victory for the Greek cities of Sicily. This was fortuitous for Agathocles, especially back then when politics and leadership was highly personal. You know, there was no such thing as a bureaucracy. There's no necessarily institution. All of this was personalized, and so victory or defeat was attributed to an individual, especially the leader. Therefore, it was a stroke of luck and ability and confidence in Agathocles that the Greeks decided to stand stalwart. And it was good because the Carthaginians were hot on their heels, and just as soon as they had entered the sanctuary, the walls of Syracuse, the Carthaginian had brought up and invested their forces against Syracuse and began a siege. Syracuse, by the way, is right on the ocean side, and the Carthaginians at this time were the preeminent naval power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. And so they were able to, in effect, completely blockade the Syracusan port, to keep any reinforcements, to keep any kind of provisions to be gotten from abroad. And so Agathocles was in a pickle. But the interesting thing that he was able to do is through a ruse and trickery, which is important, right? Ruse de guerre is important, and this is the wiles of a commander that make him truly brilliant, truly audacious. It's boldness, intelligence, ability, energy, and conviction in winning that ultimately breeds the best chances for success. And so what he does is he leaves his sons and people that he can trust inside Syracuse to resist the Carthaginians from taking over the city. And at this time, of course, he had surreptitiously secured some mercenaries from abroad, from the homeland of Greece, and did this daring raid. The raid was very interesting. Instead of outmaneuvering the Carthaginians and landing, let's say, taking the ships out from the port under the cover of night and seeking a different location on the Sicilian island to outmaneuver the Carthaginian fleet, what he decided to do was in fact strike right at the heart of the Carthaginian homeland. This was met with a lot of concern and worry. Why? Because, first of all, you're taking the majority of the military force, the potency of the defense of the city, away from the city in the hopes of securing a critical victory that will have strategic effects that is in a distant battle space campaign area. So if it were the case that Agathocles had left and gone to Africa and disaster had fallen upon him or the city, the jig was up. The war was over. Syracuse would be no more. It would just be another Greek satrapy of the Punic menace. But he was smart, and the way that he framed his campaign was one of a divine one. And he showed a sign from Hera, and I believe this. A blue ribbon fell from the sky just as the sun was starting to rise for the harbor, and it was then with the sign of Hera, that the men of Syracuse rowed their oars as hard as they could and escaped the Carthaginian blockading fleet. They were well away until finally Agathocles chose to broach the subject or the area of intent where he was going to place his units, much to the dismay of the average rank-and-file men who were either worried that they would never see their family again, or worse, die at sea, and so not be able to have the proper burial rituals which would gained them entry into Hades, and be basically succored by their progeny, who obviously back then the idea would be that you'd be buried with honors, and you'd be placed with coins over your eyes so the ferryman can take you over. And those men that can't be recovered from battle were ultimately doomed to walk the earth as a shade, as a ghost, for eternity. And so it filled the men with a special doom to die at sea. Interestingly, or coincidentally, during the Peloponnesian War, Pericles had actually set out to fight, or rather, Lysander had set out to fight Pericles in the middle of the Aegean. And ultimately, the Athenians take extreme casualties in the midst of the storm, and amidst of a combat, and the ensuing fleet was completely destroyed. Less than 10% of the seaborne fleet returned home to Athens, and ultimately it caused so much existential and religious distress amongst the polis that they almost not only overthrew Pericles, but sentenced him to death. This sounds incredible, but the true well-being of a individual's soul, to be able to go into the afterlife, was so important. These things that we consider superstitions have real effects in combat operations. Today, it takes less, it's more subtle, it has a lot more to do with leveraging confidence in one's ability, and the idea that we'll be supported from adjacent units when maybe perhaps you won't be. But Pericles was able to navigate this and to almost masterfully persuade the Athenians into accepting that actually death at sea was a form of burial. This is also where we get the heritage, the culture of burial at sea. It was he who actually coined, or rather created, the idea that to die at sea was to be a sort of religious fate, that it would give the soldier and the sailor an entry through Neptune into Hades in safe passage. Zooming back to Agathocles, of course, this fear still pervaded many of the Greeks throughout the Hellenistic world. The situation that I described earlier with Pericles that had happened roughly 100 years earlier to the time I'm describing to you now, that sentiment was very idiosyncratic to the Athenians, and it's not something that was felt elsewhere in the Greek world. And so it was only when they were well underway that Agathocles disclosed his operational scheme of maneuver. Through a combination of divine aspiration, fawning of the vanity of his men, and shaming them for the cowardice that they wanted to return home as slaves, he galvanized them by giving them visions of glory and wealth and honor. This is the secret of leadership. And with renewed efforts, they made port, or rather, they beached themselves near the city of Thebes. And upon his beaching, right, because remember, the triremes would go right on the shore. They would just row right onto the shore and be beached. And for him, what he chose to do was to ensure the resolve of his men. He chose to do a fateful maneuver that we'll hear right into the future with Cortez. He burned the ships. And in so doing, he threw the die of fate and condemned his men to either victory or death. This is a great maneuver in a way that, I think most of you can probably understand. If you're stuck in a strange land and the only hope of getting out is going through the enemy,
it's going towards conquest, then what you have done is in effect kept your men from running away. You have redoubled their resolve, not simply for trying to achieve what is in front of them, but reminding them that they're backed into a proverbial corner, or at least a campaign corner. This is great because ultimately, if you can pull it off, of course, if you can pull it off and not piss off your subordinate leaders and the rank and file, because maybe they get pissed off. Maybe they decide, you know what, you're crazy and I don't trust your leadership, I don't trust your judgment. What we're going to do is stage a mutiny and sue for terms on our own. They could have easily done that. But the quality of leadership and the resolve of the men that he instilled in them made so that the maneuver in which he chose to effectively burn the ships and invest and dedicate himself to this course, this campaign course, is what set him for success later on. Just to give you a long story short, there are some very interesting episodes in the North African campaign. There's a lot of back and forth. Ultimately, he secures a foothold. The Carthaginians sue for terms. They alleviate, or they completely lift the siege on Syracuse. The Greeks are actually able to maintain their territories in North Africa for a while, but it ended up being inconclusive, strategically speaking. And the reason being is that during the time, back and forth, so these are kind of a series of seasons of wars. A couple of years on, couple of years off, a kind of intermittent combat situation of peace and war in a kind of Napoleonic sense, where the Napoleonic Wars were a series of different tiny wars that were part of one great overarching conflict. Similar thing happened here. And during that time, he chose to recall his sons, at this time he had 2 sons, to station, garrison, and defend the territories in North Africa. Agathocles returned to Syracuse to, first of all, buttress his rule, to ensure that his rule was still firm amongst the Syracusans and the Greeks, but to lead a new host, a new expedition, against the western Sicilian Carthaginian holdings, especially with their capital in Lilybium. This all blew up in their face, unfortunately due to the incompetence of the son of Agathocles, who sought to gain glory for himself in the closing days of the war, the closing months of the war, which would have ended up in a strategic victory for the Syracusans. His second oldest son, and I believe his name is, if I'm correct here, it's Lysimachus, I believe, or rather something kind of along those lines. But in effect, what he decided to do was to make a thrust towards Carthage itself. In a kind of bold move, had it paid off, would have been a total victory over the Carthaginians in a way that would only be replicated later with the Romans during the Second Punic War. But this is where he met disaster. Disaster in the sense that when he approached the city, he had assumed that his secret Carthaginian intriguers, a faction of populist democratic types, nobles, were able to defect from the Carthaginian Senate and to make common cause and throw open the gates of the Carthaginian state for the Greeks. Luckily for the Carthaginians, they caught wind of this prior to the Greeks arriving at their walls. They slew and executed all the men who had taken part of the mutiny, and in so doing galvanized not simply the men at arms, but even the people, the general populace, took to arms, and they fought right alongside the regulars, and so sallied forth out of the city with massive numbers to what ultimately became a decisive and resounding defeat of the Greek forces in Carthage and in Africa as a whole. And so the entire fortunes of war, right from the jaws of victory, let's say, this son of Agathocles snatched defeat. It was an awful setback
One which caused Agathocles to sue for terms with the Carthaginians, which ultimately amounted to a white peace, which saw the resumption of the original balance of forces and territories that had been the case at the start of the war. So the Greeks lost everything in Africa. They lost their holdings in western Sicily because of this one foolhardy, glory-seeking son of Agathocles. And funnily enough, Agathocles, in spite of his son's foolhardiness, and if it had been any other commander, would have been tried and executed for the great failure and the cause of a defeat in war, defended his son and refused to execute him or even punish him for his initiative. And in some weird way, he was still able to completely maneuver himself out of the situation and reassert his dynasty's power over the Syracusans. Now, if you are telling me that's not a master of communication, a master of the crowds, I don't know what is. But the rest of the story of Agathocles is not as eventful as the events I had recounted to you just now. Of course, the campaigns are a lot more rich and full of detail, and I highly recommend reading the book that we offer at DVX Publishing, obviously under the name Agathocles. Right, it's a scholastic work from the early 1900s that synthesizes all the various strands from the primary sources of ancient Greek and Roman historians regarding or recounting the life of Agathocles. But it's kind of beside the point, right? Because what happens after is pretty mundane, though no less important. Once Agathocles sues for peace, he enters a period of a long peace, right? So it's no longer studded with wars and kind of chaos and continued bold moves or anything like that. I think he recognized the fact that Syracuse had come to be just exhausted. And so, in a masterful stroke, in a way that a prince should administer his estates, to cultivate it, to make it prosperous and strong, to make it something worth actually being proud of, he endeavored, through the fame of his name, to send out a call for colonists, for specialized artisans, for soldiers, and so on, to repopulate Syracuse, to make up for all the lost brothers and uncles and fathers and sons who had perished in that great Iliad of the Western Mediterranean. And it would go on to be just a very prosperous trade city and regained her position as the preeminent trade port in the Hellenic world of the Western Mediterranean, as a crossroads between all the different civilizations which populated the coasts of the Mediterranean. And she came to a new flourishing. And this is in no small part to the governorship, of course, of Agathocles as a good prince, but more importantly, the fame that she had won for herself. Agathocles is reflected upon in rather dim terms. Machiavelli did not think highly of him. In fact, he cited him as an example in The Prince, the book that was effectively a mirror for the Medici that he was trying to ingratiate himself with, as an example of taking the principles that Machiavelli was trying to make the case for how a prince should conduct himself, how those principles could be taken too far. Because, for the most part, Agathocles was a very capable political maneuverer. He was a fox and a lion. He was all those things which a prince should be in the eyes of Machiavelli, or at least how he conveyed the story of what a prince should emulate. And he gave various other examples, and usually he held up Cesare Borgia as the archetype. But to Machiavelli's eyes, and I'll read exactly the quote that I'm just trying to reference for you here. He says in chapter 8 of The Prince, he says, in regards to Agathocles, of course, he says, "Yet it cannot be called virtue, or virtu, to slay fellow citizens, to deceive friends, to be without faith, without mercy, without religion. Such methods may gain empire, but not glory. And so it's kind of a refutation, in a way, a rebuke to what Machiavelli was saying, or rather, it was a kind of hypocrisy on his own part, that he couldn't stomach the means by which empire was gained. And so he had to slight him and imply that his means did not give him glory. And much to the opposite. But I'll make the case here in a second, but just think about this. And there are many stories of the bad things that he engaged in. He engaged in bad faith constantly. He was truly tyrannical in the modern sense to those who were dissenters of his power. He did not take into account the counsel of his fellows, or at least the leading citizens, unless they were yes men. He was imperious. He was stubborn. He was all these things that a forceful prince needs to be. He was a true autocrat. And back in those days, it would work because it's a smaller polity, and the systems of political social organization is a lot more simple, right? It lends itself to this kind of lack of collegiality. But I would go the opposite. And I'll tell you why, Legionnaire. I'll tell you why. Because ultimately, think of Syracuse prior to Agathocles. Yes, it was the site of Timoleon, who had come from Corinth to save Syracuse. And prior to him, there was this great tyrant called Phalaris that had effectively come to the aid of the Corsarians during the Peloponnesian War, and who was the principal purpose of Syracuse's preeminence in the trade of the Mediterranean. But what really raised Syracuse to the level of the most celestial of Greek cities in that oikoumene, that universe that studded the Aegean and the Mediterranean as a whole, well, it was his daring, his drive, his will, his self-overcoming, and therefore the overcoming of the city itself. It's not enough to just simply be existing in this world. This is no less true for a polity, a family, or any other greater social group as it is for an individual. Just as Nietzsche would say that the instinct for the will to power is the will to life, that is to expand, to grow, to be master, and so on. To be stagnant is the ultimate sign of death, of the downgoing, of the lessening of vital powers, as he would say. Or I'm paraphrasing here. And during the power of the 600, those men, those oligarchs, those plutocrats really, who controlled the city, did not actually advance the interests of the city beyond the scope of what their personal interests were. Their course of warfare and governorship and political acumen only extended as far as their economic interests were concerned. Okay? And this is good and bad, right? When you coincide the interests, the inducements of a political structure to your personal interests to attain great things, that can lead to good things, right? The American Republic is one of these great machinations of political thought which was able to induce the citizens to greatness. But geopolitical histories like that are just so rare. To say nothing, of course, of the fact that the American Republic was at its highest when it had a Caesar. For better or for worse, I love Andrew Jackson, but he was a Caesar. And then later, of course, Theodore Roosevelt. And then, for as much as I hate that commie, FDR was certainly an American Caesar. And so on and so forth. And the great exploits of a city-state, or rather a nation, is usually the measure of great leaders who have great plans for their polity, that expand itself, that make it prosperous and hegemonic. If it hadn't been for Agathocles, Syracuse would have been this middling city that existed on the rim, that was known to be rich, and if anything would have been simply the object of the encroaching enemy's desire, surrounded by wolves baring their teeth and only defending and advancing their interest so long as these oligarchs felt as though it was in their personal interest. But the interesting thing about autocracy, about what is called tyranny, right? And this is the ancient archaic way I'm trying to intend this term, right? So basically the rule of one is that in the unity of a sovereign, we're able to completely unify the political impetus and centralize and concentrate the will of an entire nation. The reason why tyranny took on a negative term was precisely because it was sovereigns such as Agathocles and Pisistratus and so on that were able to overthrow and subdue the rapacity and idiocy and incompetence and infighting of the elites who were only there to get theirs and who did not think beyond themselves. They were small souls that had big bank accounts and big retinues of men. And the trouble with oligarchs of this type is that they're sated with so little. They don't dream big dreams. They don't dare great daring, bold feats of adventure. And the reason why, in my mind, I believe that Agathocles is on par with someone of his contemporary, because he lived during the same time as Alexander the Great. The difference is that Alexander the Great was born to a kingdom to inherit the armed forces, well-honed and militarily innovated forces of the phalangites and the companion cavalry and the kind of innovations of warfare that the Macedonians brought to the table. But this was all pre-made and centralized and regimented and prepared for when Alexander took power. For someone like Agathocles, who came from very mean origins, who came from probably the lower middle class, and through his own virtue and daring and greatness of spirit was bold enough to advance himself to such a level that he became the first sovereign in a very long time of a unified polity of Syracuse. And unfortunately, whether you like it or not, and this is regardless of the type of revolution that goes on, you're going to have to crack some eggs to make an omelet. And what I enjoy so much about Agathocles, for as much as he does do some pretty heinous things and offends the gods by stealing the treasury of the gods and so on, he's the reason why Syracuse reached beyond itself, that made its name, that carved its destiny and its glory in the hearts of men forever. If it hadn't been for him, it would have just been another podunk freaking Greek city in the Hellenic world that we would just gloss over, possibly, in the history books. Okay? This is the same thing for life applied, Legionary. For your life, what's the point of living if the point of living is mere existence, just to be a good boy, to aim low, to achieve lower, to exist in pain and suffering, and to die anyway? Is it not better to tempt the fates, to be charged with, let's say, ignominy of actions required for greatness, if it means that everyone is elevated, everyone attains the excellence associated with you? I tell you what, I think it's a lot better than what it is today. The existence of the middle class life is awful. So many men walk around with purposelessness in their hearts, and they're lost and fearful and in constant psychological pain because of the lack of grand purpose, grand visions and missions that make you dream. This is what Agathocles gave to Syracuse. This is what Agathocles ultimately redeemed Syracuse of itself. And therefore, Legionaries, this is the purpose behind this long-winded transmission. Usually I keep it to an hour or under 2 hours. However, I felt like it was important to go into the depths and the details of this great soldier prince, because he is an archetype of greatness, of high-spiritedness, of daring, of leadership, of both prince and commander, of philosopher.
But most importantly, he is probably the closest archetype to something we should emulate ourselves in our current life. Like Agathocles, we are in a republic dominated by plutocrats who are self-serving, who engender distrust and stasis with the average people, with the common people, and who see no further than their bottom line, than their personal aggrandizement, and the horizons of their ambitions are so incredibly petty. Further, and worse still, perhaps the worst condemnation is that they are not men of culture. Remember, Aristotle defines the politikos as a man who binds the culture with the state and the command. So these three different elements are essential. And this is the purpose behind the transmission, to cultivate you into soldier princes, not merely commanders and warriors in the field, but also statesmen and men of high taste and culture. Why is it that it seems frivolous to talk about culture, especially nowadays when culture is so vulgarized and petty and base that culture is synonymous with the absurd productions of Hollywood that we're exposed to on a daily basis? Completely wash your mind of that detritus. Think instead of a higher vision of life. And the Greeks were great precisely because they chose the aristocratic values enshrined and disseminated throughout the polis, and so leavened the entirety, the unity of that polis to higher and higher peaks. I know this sounds crazy, but what you see and hear and think colors who you are. They inform your actions. Your actions over time become your habits, and your habits ultimately are your destiny. You are poisoned with visions and ideas and experiences which are defined by weakness, and in these small crevices and niches of this modern world where you can carve out or eke out an existence that slowly or somewhat approximates the great spirited life of Hellenic worlds, which sported great men like Alexander the Great and Pericles and freaking Lysander of Sparta. We have to think to ourselves, there is nothing that is keeping us from replicating that same genius. All that is preventing us from doing these things is hearing, seeing, acting, and ultimately habituating what is excellent in us, in man himself. And that is the meaning of philosophy. Philosophy is not simply this abstract notion of the idea or the good, or this kind of academic masturbation in the professor's office after hours. You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Like Stacy from freaking college knows what I'm talking about. But hopefully you don't, Legionnaires. But what I'm trying to get at, brother, what I'm trying to get at, friends, is that ultimately, without the unity and the ideal of self-overcoming, of pushing not simply oneself, but taking ownership of one's surroundings, one's community, one's family, ultimately one's nation, one's city, right? I like calling it the city. You're not able to dream great dreams. So much of your morals that were instilled in you since you were born are designed to think atomically, to be an individual, to react to the environment outside oneself, and let that be your fate. Agathocles should show you that what is not the end. The world is changeable for those of you with the will and the intellect and the daring to change it. There's this great scene from The Departed where it begins and it talks about, like, One thing I can't stand about the expletive, I can't say the word on here, is that they are a reflection of their environment. I've always wanted to be, or rather, I wanted my environment to be a reflection of me. You have to change your mindset and your spiritual vigor to be effusive, to form grand visions in your mind and your heart and project them out into the world through your actions and through your excellence, and see them manifest physically, materially, spiritually in the lives and buildings and culture and things around you. Higher life will never come from the petty moralism of the herd. It will always come from the great daring princes that are both foxes and lions where it suits them, and leviathans and great friends in others. Ultimately, legionaries, the purpose of this project has obviously to do with making you a good man, to making you healthy and strong, to be a good warrior and defender, retainer of all that you hold dear to yourself. But to be more than that, to be a philosopher in the greatest sense. And so I'll leave you with this quote from Nietzsche to summarize the purpose, the greatness of Agathocles, and hopefully you can birth the Agathocles in your heart, in our time, in our own nation. And I'm reading here from Nietzsche. True philosophers, they are commanders and legislators. They alone determine the whither and wherefore of man. With creative hands they touch the future. Their search for knowledge is creation. Their creation is legislation. Their will for truth is will for power. Thank you, legionaries, for tuning in, for lasting this long. Without further ado, this is General Lance, Sergeant Barnes, Bruta Historia, signing off.